Welcome to Culture Crush with me, your host, Dan Dowman, where we get to meet some of the world's leading culture shapers, future makers, and power shakers. Today's episode is brought to you by Anthem, and as always, we'll be talking groundbreaking cultures, leadership challenges, and what you can do about them. Today on the show, I'm joined by the most excellent culture shaper, Justin Bariso. Justin, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, Dan. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, I'm glad that we could make this work because you and I have been emailing backwards and forwards for quite a few months now and trying to get dates to line up. And I'm so thrilled that we're able to make this happen. And the exciting thing for me is probably not very exciting for you, but the exciting thing for me, and maybe a handful of my guests, is that this is a milestone episode. You are joining me for episode 60. And if anybody had asked me at the beginning of the year whether I was going to make 60 podcast episodes this year, I probably would have said, yeah, maybe, because I had that ambition. But it feels like it's been a long and exciting road full of really rich conversations and really excellent people. And I'm glad that you were able to round out 2024 with me. So thanks again for making the time.
No, I'm so happy to be here. It's I'm a big fan of you and what you do, as you know. And I think, that alone is just such a huge accomplishment. Like, of course, the production that goes into all of this and, so much work goes into each one of these episodes. But then just thinking back and, man, you've had 60 really great conversations where you've learned so much, your audience has learned so much, and no doubt your guests have too. So yeah, congratulations. That's great. And I'm so happy to be a part of this one.
Well, thank you so much. Feels like a great way to end the year, that's for sure. Now, you're the founder and principal of EQ Applied, and that was kind of new on me when I first kind of came across your profile about a year ago. So why don't you give us an idea of what that is and what you're trying to get done? And obviously it's about emotional intelligence. So tell us the story, like what do you want to get done in the world?
Yeah, sure. So emotional intelligence is one of those things where, it can be very abstract for people. They think of it in terms of qualities like empathy and soft skills, and it definitely includes all that. I like to use two definitions for emotional intelligence just to make it easily understandable and relatable to people. There's kind of the textbook definition, which is emotional intelligence is the ability to understand and manage your emotions. You can think of the fact that we're all emotional creatures, and that's a good thing. Our emotions motivate us. Our emotions can inspire us. They can inspire others, but they can also get us into trouble sometimes when they get out of balance. And sometimes we say or do things that we later regret, or our way of doing things rubs someone the wrong way, can get in the way of our relationship. So that kind of brings us to the second definition, which I really like to use, a very practical definition, which is emotional intelligence is the ability to make emotions work for you instead of against you. And so that's what I do. I help individuals, I help organizations to kind of build that emotional intelligence into their culture and into their everyday life, to have a habit of building emotional intelligence so their emotions aren't getting in the way of their goals, but rather are helping them achieve them.
Yeah, I love that turn of phrase about making emotions work for you instead of against you. When I've been consulting for different businesses throughout my career, I've often tried to help leaders see that your instincts are great, your gut feelings are great, right? They can really be powerful. But also the other end of the spectrum, instinct can kind of act as a bit of an enemy to you sometimes because it can push you towards a reactive mindset rather than a responsive mindset. When you're sort of jumping to alert, you're jumping to your first response and you instinctively think that you're right. But actually sometimes if you're leading a team or if you're trying to make really good decisions about who you want to be and how you want to show up, sometimes instinct and feeling and emotion really isn't the thing you should be leaning into, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's all about keeping it in balance because like we said, your instincts and your gut feelings, those can all be good in certain situations. And it's all about learning how to leverage, those strengths of yours. But in other situations, they can actually prove to hold you back at times. And so, for me, I think it's about identifying, okay, where are these traits and these instincts and what I say and do, where are they helping me? And let me lean into that. And where are they harming me? And they get it again, it's all about being goal oriented. How is this getting in the way of me reaching my goals? And we can talk about specific examples of this as well. But that's for every single one of us. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and it's learning how to leverage the strengths and mitigate the weaknesses.
One of the things that I talk about in my work with Anthem all the time is the model of collective fluency, which is really a model for group practice. And people who listen to the show regularly would have heard me talk about it several times. But it's simply this, that when we have a goal or something that we want to achieve, we need to translate it into intentions, actions, and outcomes. And sometimes people debate me on the first point because they like to say that intentions are about the heart and are about like feeling and making a feeling driven choice. Whereas I'm not saying that intentions are about disengaging from the heart, but I think your intentions are born, they're a choice that you make based on feelings, data, inputs that you've got around you. And then you make a decision, you set an intention about how am I going to choose to respond to some of that stuff. So in a kind of group setting, it might be to do with organizational values, that you say, our intention is to play as a team, for example. Then that intention has some corresponding actions attached to it. So like, what does that look like in the real world? And then what are the outcomes we hope to see from following that process? Now, of course, when you've gone through that process and you get positive outcomes, that feeds back into your intentions. But I also love how that can be used at a personal level, that when you're thinking about how do I want to show up in the world, what emotions are working for me, what emotions are working against me, and then thinking through, okay, so how do I turn that into an intention? And what are the actions that kind of followed from that? And then what are the outcomes that I'm looking for? Now, I know that I've just introduced a model that you might be unfamiliar with, but how does that sound to you?
Oh yeah, definitely. So here's, as you're saying that, I was thinking of a practical example to illustrate that. So, in my work, we talk a lot about the personality traits. We use many in your audience are probably familiar with what's called the Big Five model of personality traits. And the easy way to remember that is there's an acronym, OCEAN. So we talk about openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And this is a model that's been developed over decades, and most scientists, researchers, psychologists accept this model as the basic personality model, that we all our personalities can be described and analyzed through the lens of those 5 traits. Now, that's of course an oversimplification, because just with those 5 traits, you can be anywhere on the spectrum of all of them, and that can really influence. There's just countless variations, as we know. I mean, there's I don't even know anymore. How many billions of people are on Earth now? I've lost track. I think it's 6 billion now, right?
Eight, something like that. Yeah.
So, you got these billions of people on Earth, and no 2 people exactly alike. And so just with those 5 traits, you have these countless variations. So taking one of the traits, for example, agreeableness. All right. Agreeableness talks about your tendency towards social harmony. So you want, if you're high on the agreeableness spectrum, you want social harmony. You want to agree with people as much as possible. And that can be good, because you can be a peacemaker. You can help manage conflict. There's all kinds of strengths that come along with that. But it can also harm you in other situations where, you're consistently putting your ideas and values behind other people's until it builds up and you kind of, have a breakdown or a blow up because you just can't take it anymore. Or it could be, it's very hard for you to give critical feedback, or it's very hard for you to speak up when somebody needs to speak up. And so that's where that same level of agreeableness that proved to be a strength in some situations is actually holding you back in other situations. And so just kind of having the intention and the outcome of what you want. So for example, for myself, I rank pretty high on the agreeableness spectrum. And early on in my career as a manager, it held me back in some situations. It helped me in some situations, but held me back in others. So knowing, for example, that critical feedback can be very hard for me to do, and I try to soften it too much. And I used to try to use the sandwich method, and then the other person wouldn't really get, the point in the end, or or, everything would get lost. So I knew, okay, I need to practice my feedback. How am I actually going to say this in a way that the other person's going to get the point, but at the same time where I don't destroy the relationship? And practicing it ahead of time also lowered my stress level, because as a highly agreeable person, just that conversation alone, was stressing me out. So practicing it ahead of time, preparing well, it doesn't necessarily make it easy, but it made it much easier.
Yeah, I love that. And I love how that really does speak to when I talk about the model of collective fluency with people. I often say, look, this really can be applied at a group level when you're, let people around you know that we're thinking through this model and we're using this as a way to guide our thoughts and guide our decisions, right? Then I often remind people that, hey, but if you're a CEO and you've got to deliver a town hall meeting, if you walk into that room and think, what's the intention? What's the action I need people to follow? And what are the outcomes that I'm hoping for? That is going to make you so much more precise in what you communicate. Or if you're thinking through, as someone who over-indexes on agreeableness, I've got to give some critical feedback, and that's kind of keeping me up at night, right? If you actually take that thought and go, okay, so what is the intention of the conversation I need to have? What are the actions that I'm going to ask that person to take? And then what are the outcomes we can discuss and share together, right? It's just a way of channeling some of those skills in a way into really meaningful conversations. So I love that kind of practical reflection on that. Now, I've already steered us kind of way off track, because you and I were having a great conversation before we hit record about we're going to do the culture crush and then leadership challenges and solutions, but we're sort of already there. So I'm going to pull it back, right? Because I've got a couple of questions about you and your career path and a bit more about your story. The first is, so alongside being the principal and founder of EQ Applied, you're also a columnist for Inc. magazine. And for anyone who's kind of checked out your profile, you'll see an enormous number. You are knocking on the door of 200,000 followers. And so I'm just kind of interested in how that story has unfolded, because I'm sure people who are kind of like, I want to make my life about emotional intelligence, don't set out to get huge followings on social media. So I'm kind of wondering, how did that story unfold? Like, when was there a shift when you were like, people are really tuning into this? This is really important, because you've really gathered a really interesting tribe of people behind you.
It's a long story. I'll try to make it short, because it was a very non-traditional path. The first kind of, I describe it as my first life, because it seems so long ago. My first life, I spent 13 years working for a very mission-driven nonprofit in New York City. And I loved that life, but I left it behind when me and my wife decided to have children. Or our first one was actually a surprise, and then we kind of leaned into it. We have 4 now. And my wife is from Germany. So she was living with me there in New York, and we decided to kind of shift gears and to move to Europe, back to Germany, where she was from, to be closer to her family when we had, or before we had, our first child. So that was a bit of a scary move, and it's a long story, like we said, because it's a big decision, but it was the right decision for us. I don't regret anything about that decision, but it was a little bit rough in the beginning, because I didn't know exactly what I was going to do. So I was leaving my job behind. I started working for myself. My first job over here was helping German executives. Really, I was a glorified English teacher. I was helping them with their business English, but that kind of job can be very low paying, or you can kind of differentiate yourself. And so I fortunately I worked for a company that gave me a lot of liberty, and I started, leveraging what I had learned in over a decade in management for this nonprofit, and teaching strategy, and teaching some of these soft skills. And what I didn't realize at the time was called emotional intelligence. And so as I started researching this and helping people develop their skills, I eventually, the Inc. column, that was through LinkedIn. I made a connection on LinkedIn. Jeff Hayden, who is, he was the #1 Inc. columnist at the time, the most widely read columnist, and he's still right up there. Millions of readers, over the years. And he is just a really nice guy. And, I reached out to him cold and started asking him questions, and he gave me critique on my own writing and offered to interview with me at one point, because I was running the small business, and I was sharing these lessons through my own writing just on LinkedIn. And so when he asked me that, it made me think like, hey, can I get my own column on Inc? And I asked him directly, and he's like, sure, I'll put in a good word for you. And that was it. And so there's a lesson that actually I've seen repeated over and over again is good things come to those who ask. Those who wait, yes, but also those who ask, because, I only got that because I asked directly for it. And, it wasn't a guarantee. I had to make a pitch. It was kind of a difficult pitch. I had to come up with, I believe they wanted like an idea for like either 6 or 10 columns, and you had to be able to write 6 columns a month, which at the time sounded like, oh man, how in the world will I even do that? I still had my day job at the time, but it was, I was working for myself and I had a day job. That's a long story too. But anyway, that column, my very first column was on empathy. So a very big part of emotional intelligence. And then I kind of found that there was this gap in the emotional intelligence literature or the field, whatever you want to call it. There was a lot of the theoretical, but there wasn't so much of the practical. And by practical, I mean how to. So like, what are frameworks? What are ways that you can apply these principles in your everyday life? But also like just real life examples. I am the opposite of most of the people that are well known in the emotional intelligence field, like Daniel Goleman, who kind of popularized the concept. He didn't invent it, but he popularized it, and he has a PhD. And you have others like Travis Bradberry, who wrote a big book, and I believe he has a PhD as well. I didn't have any of that. I didn't come from that traditional academic background. But for me, that was an advantage because, I was able to say, hey, well, let's see how this stuff looks in real life. Check out this email that Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella wrote that was made public. And let's look for signs of emotional intelligence. And let's see how he's using some of these principles to motivate his employees. Oh, here's another one. Howard Schultz from Starbucks. He just wrote a company-wide email. And it's pretty exceptionally written. Sure, maybe he had help, maybe he had a team, but there are some things in here, some principles that we can pull out and see, okay, how can we develop those? And no one was doing that at the time, and it just seemed to really hit. So my column went from 0, because I started from scratch, to eventually making between 1 and 2 million readers a month. And then, I would repost a lot of stuff on LinkedIn. LinkedIn recognized that, and they kind of gave me some attention and promoted my work. And that's how the LinkedIn audience got built up. And I've kind of neglected it actually over the years. So it got to 200,000 and it kind of just stayed there for a while. And that's really something I'm focused on in the next year or so, is building it back up and starting to share some of these lessons again, because the LinkedIn, the LinkedIn world has changed too, where they used to promote and highlight a lot of long form stuff. Nowadays, everything is short form. And if any of your audience are LinkedIn, they probably know that. And so that's what in the process now is taking a lot of these lessons and turning them into bite-sized chunks that you can just put on LinkedIn and make it easier for people to see what you're all about and to see what kind of value is offered through these skills.
There's 2 things I really love about that story. The first is when you spoke to Jeff and said, Jeff, cold outreach, let's have a conversation. It led to the column opportunity. I love the fact that you asked for it, that you were brave enough to say, this is something I care about. But the step before that was you just being willing to show up and enter that conversation, to volunteer yourself, to have that conversation with somebody. And one of the things that I'm a huge advocate of in my career and trying to grow Anthem and trying to grow the podcast is reach out to people. Like, be brave and have the conversation. It's what we did together, right? You found me in your LinkedIn inbox and I said, Justin, it seems like we're talking about similar things. Here's a bit of my story. Do you think we could have a conversation? Now, it was then in that conversation that we agreed then to do the podcast. And, the podcast comes with a little bit of relationship. But the willingness to show up and have the conversation is absolutely crucial. And I just think there's so many people out there who are thinking, the world isn't really for me at the moment, or it's not really giving me opportunities. But there is perhaps a challenge there for those people to say, are you putting yourself in the way of the opportunity train? Like, are you putting yourself in the room or in the conversations where those possibilities can begin to take shape? And I had a great conversation a few episodes before this one comes out. Actually, I think it's going to be the episode just before this one. So if you haven't listened to it yet, guys, listen to Steve talk a week ago. But Steve is a fantastic social justice advocate in the UK. He is the founder of Oasis, and they run schools up and down the country, and they're building hubs, community hubs for communities all over the UK and around the world. They have a big international presence as well. And I asked him a similar question, like, how did this happen? Because he's a half Indian guy from a poor neighborhood in South London, and he's in his 60s now. And the trajectory of his life is really surprising. And I said, like, how did it happen? Like, where did this vision come from to start schools, for example? By the time they started schools, they'd already were a successful, quite a large charity. And he just said this. He said, well, I was at a funeral, and I'd been asked to take this funeral for somebody. And there was a guy there who was just sat in the row in front of me. And so naturally, I just got talking to him. And it turned out that this guy was called Tony, and he went on to become the Prime Minister of the UK. And he told the story to Tony Blair, that of this school that he'd started in India. And so when Tony Blair became Prime Minister, he said, hey, Tony, do you remember that conversation we had about schools? And Tony said, yeah, I would really love for you to start thinking about, could you bring some of those lessons and disciplines to the school system here in the UK? And that was the start. But it came from the fact that there was no pretense or expectation in that conversation, right? It was just human to human. This guy's in front of me and I'm going to say hello. Yeah. And in that small act of showing up, unlocked this incredible opportunity. You never know when you're going to meet another Tony, right? But I guess the real lesson to take away there is just show up for the people around you. Be in the conversations. Be in the room, because you never know what opportunities that might unlock for you. So huge segue. But Steve, thank you for your inspiration, and thank you, obviously, for your story. And you mentioned the Starbucks email. Who wrote that email again?
Howard Schultz. So he was CEO at the time. He's primarily known as founder of Starbucks, although he didn't start the company, but he probably played the largest role in getting Starbucks to where it is today.
So on your LinkedIn, because I'm going to encourage anybody to go and visit you there, you were talking about, I think in the last couple of days, you've posted about a Starbucks email. Is that the email that we're talking about now? Are you revisiting it, or is that a new thing?
No. This is years ago. In fact, I don't want to jump ahead, but I think we're going to talk about how do we call it? Culture crush.
Yeah.
Right. So actually, Starbucks is a company that I've identified to talk about, and there's a lot of companies that are doing good in the world of emotional intelligence, and others not so good. And Starbucks is one of those that has gone up and down, and it's to be expected, because they went from a relatively small company to this global company with thousands and thousands, I believe at this point, hundreds of thousands of employees. And that's hard to manage, right? So you're going to have problems that increase in complexity as you manage that size of workforce. But anyway, no, what I wrote about in recently, Starbucks has a new CEO. For any of your listeners, I'm sure many of your listeners are up to the news on this, but many are not. In fact, I've found that a lot of people don't even know exactly what's going on with Starbucks right now. But they've slipped quite a bit internationally, but even within the U.S., they had a CEO that was there for about 12 to 18 months that they recently let go, and who they've brought in now is the former CEO of Chipotle, who they kind of poached him from his position, Brian Niccol. And he has a huge reputation in the restaurant world. He used to work before Chipotle. He worked for Taco Bell. So talking about like going to a competitor, right? He had a great reputation already for Taco Bell and Yum brands. And then he came into Chipotle, and really when they were kind of at their lowest after they had some bad publicity and bad health issues. I can't even remember I believe it was norovirus at the time or something like this. So they were just really, really down, and he did a complete turnaround and had Chipotle going like this. And now Starbucks has brought him over, hoping he can do the same thing. And, I've read a lot and watched a lot of him, but because he's a superstar basically in the restaurant world, and people have high hopes. And I was kind of skeptical because I didn't follow him so closely at Chipotle. But since he took over Starbucks, I started digging in and looking at past interviews and whatever I could find, articles written on him, and it was very vanilla, for lack of a better word. He sounded like every other CEO, and I didn't see anything so special. But he recently had his first earnings call with Starbucks, and this was really his first public. He may have done one or two interviews before that, but I don't even think he did. So for me, this was his first big appearance where he had both prepared remarks, but he had to answer questions from investors and anyone who was on that call. And I was just so impressed with the way he handled himself and with his goals, going back to outcomes and intention. I had read some of his goals for Starbucks and where he wanted to head, but the way he was going about doing that and the plans that he had in being able to reach those goals, I felt like very well defined. And much of it was gathered according to him, but there's evidence of this in him him going to visit the baristas, okay? But not just like, because Starbucks CEOs have encouraged us for a long time, going and, working with them. And I think that's a great practice as well. But he kind of did it, at least that's what the report is, undercover, like just showed up in places. I think not even everyone would know who he is as he walked into Starbucks, Starbucks employees we're talking about. And that just kind of gave him the chance to see what is Starbucks operating at right now in any given store, and then really talk one-on-one and get the real experience. And this seems to have really informed his strategy. And so, the proof is in the pudding, so we're yet to see, will his turnaround strategy work? But I was just really impressed with what he set out in that call, and that's what that article was all about.
Would you say, therefore, that Starbucks is your culture crush, or is it the new CEO? Or both?
Well, it's kind of yet to be seen. I think in the past, they've done well. And I've known people that have and continue to work for Starbucks and raved about the brand and the culture they were building. But I think they've also lost their way in the past few years. So the past Starbucks is kind of my culture crush, and I'm curious to see if they can get back there with what Nichols has planned.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll keep our eyes on that story as it develops. And as I said to you before this call, and I say this to all my guests, when we talk about a culture crush, we're never endorsing a whole culture, right? Because it can't be done. But you can highlight things from the past or things that are currently going on that indicate things that we should, as leaders and community shapers, that we should listen to and pay attention to. Like, sometimes a business might have lots of flaws, but they might have this one way of creating content or this one way of managing meetings that you go, but that thing is gold. And I need to see if I can borrow that and bring that across to where I work. So those kind of culture crush moments are all over the place. Even in organizations that are struggling in lots of ways, you can still find those little moments.
And that'll be the one big challenge that I'm really looking at right now. So what Starbucks' biggest challenge, I think, beyond, the sales slips and that kind of thing, but with their own people, which again, going back some years, traditionally, they had a great reputation for providing great benefits for their people, continuing education. Starbucks was one of the first companies to offer, this won't be as important in the UK, but in the US, to offer health insurance for part-time employees. They had all these things going for them. And through the years, one of the things they've kind of lost their way with is, Starbucks employees feeling like they're not well treated, which has given birth to them wanting to start or join a union. And the way Starbucks has handled that has been very divisive. Yeah. And Howard Schultz, who, I'm a fan of a lot of what he's done, but he's just kind of like tried to turn it aside. We don't need that. We want to handle things in-house, that kind of thing. It hasn't been convincing. And so I'm curious to see how Brian Niccol, the new CEO, handles that problem, because maybe it's true. A lot of people believe unions are good, and you need that to achieve what the workforce is looking for. Others don't. And really, I'm not here to take a side either way, but the question is, can Brian Nichols solve this problem in a way that employees are feel taken care of, whether that is through a union or not through a union. And so that's, like you said, as these challenges rise, and they expected to with such a big company, but how does management handle that in a way that helps people feel cared for? Because as we know, if you take care of the people, then the work's going to take care of itself.
You're so right. And I often talk about with people the difference between rightness, in leadership, and wholeness in leadership. When people lead with rightness, and maybe this speaks to what we talked about earlier in this conversation about instinct and emotion and the kind of like those emotional triggers, many of us, and me included, when I'm in a debate, I'm often not thinking about kind of like really what's right and wrong. I just want to win the debate sometimes, right? Like I get caught out by that sense of ego and wanting to win. But we know in businesses all around the world, there are lots of people in authority that really their obsession in life and their security in life comes from their sense of I'm right and everybody else is wrong. But what leaders need to tap into is this sense of wholeness. Because what you're talking about with those Starbucks employees, when Starbucks employees get healthcare, even though they were only working a part-time job, when they get other benefits that look after their well-being at a broader level, you're really unlocking their connection with wholeness. They begin to see themselves not just as part of a machine, but somebody who is cared for, welcomed, really looked after in that three-dimensional way. And anywhere that you feel like that, that's when you feel liberated to create, liberated to innovate, liberated to share your ideas or your criticisms without fear of being told you're wrong or shut down. And that's what you need from your workforce. But it doesn't come from a relationship where the power is seen as right or wrong. It comes from when that leader can really tap into that sense of wholeness. How can I really meet the needs of these people at a holistic level? Because when I do that, that's when they really start coming to work. It's a weird thing because you don't want to lean into wholeness because you want to unlock better performance. That kind of feels like it's got to be an authentic choice that you genuinely care about people, right? Like it has to feel authentic and real. But if you can do that, you're going to lead a business that is going to last, right? That is going to outlast the competition. Like they're the businesses that, if we were to run through our kind of list of top 10 businesses or organizations in the world, I would bet that every single one of them had high instances where their team, their people are treated and welcomed with that sense of wholeness. Like, how do I look after the whole person, not just the employee?
Yeah, definitely.
So we were going to come and talk about leadership challenges and what people can do about them. I sort of think we're already kind of in that territory, in that space. But tell me about a leadership challenge or a culture challenge that you've been bumping into lately that you wanted to talk about.
So it goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago with these personality differences. And, again, just this infinite variation of personality. And so what I see time and time again is problems within organizations. And I put myself right there. I've had some of these same problems where you have a personality difference with someone else. You just kind of rub each other the wrong way. And that makes it very hard to collaborate. It makes it very hard to get work done. Sometimes you're, stalling work. And it goes back to what you were talking about a minute ago as well, Dan, of that wanting to be right, and that getting in the way of work getting done at times. And so, that's the challenge I'm seeing a lot of, and I think we've seen for years and years, and we continue to see, and I'm hopefully helping individuals and organizations start to address.
So thinking of that as a challenge, what are the ways in for leaders and organizations to respond to that? Like, I know that you've been thinking around some questions or a framework, a way that people can really engage with, turn what we're talking about as kind of an abstract, kind of high level concept into something that they can really take action with. How do you want people to respond to this challenge? Like, what are some of the things that you want them to take away and try?
I guess I would focus on two things. So one of them is actually getting to know your personality and kind of the emotional underpinnings and the reasons why you feel the way you do about things and why you operate the way you do. Understanding that about yourself, because that goes back to what we talked about at the very beginning of this conversation was if I know where what my personality is like, and I know what causes me to say or do the things that I do, and operate the way that I do, then I can identify situations where, again, I can leverage the strength, mitigate the weakness. So one way to illustrate it is we go back to talking about agreeable versus disagreeable. So if we have, a team, and in that team, you're going to have different levels. People are going to lean, on different ends of the spectrum, some on highly disagreeable, which, for someone like me, the way I used to think is like, oh man, why do they always have to, voice their opinion on every single thing? Why can't they just go along with things? Why can't they just support things? And that's true. Sometimes maybe that's proving to be a weakness on their point, but it can be a strength at the same time. When someone like that is on your side and they're negotiating with someone else, for example, it can really help to get you, your team, on the personal side, your family, something that you're looking for. I think about going to negotiate with a used car salesman, for example, and I used to hate doing that. I always brought my dad along. My dad's very disagreeable. He had no problem telling the salesman, this is a bad deal and why, et cetera, et cetera. And, there's different ways to negotiate, of course, too. But again, just seeing those differences, not necessarily as, oh, I hate that, but rather, what's the good in it? And how can we work with this, right? So if you have a highly disagreeable person on your team, hey, how can we leverage that for good? And at the same time, how can I learn to work with that person? So it may be having that one-to-one conversation with them, because a lot of times those highly disagreeable people don't realize how they're being interpreted or perceived, right? And they're just voicing their opinion because this is what they think is right. So getting to know yourself and what is your personality style, as well as the other person's, then, you have that, you can speak more openly, more transparently, and be like, look, every time we have this conversation, it ends up going your way. Just give me a moment. Let's talk this through. Can you hear, what I'm trying to say? And that's how it starts. And many times what happens from the other person, what are you talking about? I don't do that. Like, okay, but once you get past that, okay, well, just listen what I have to say. And now you kind of start to establish a culture where there's more listening, where the one side understands, okay, they're going to voice their opinion in a very strong way, and that's okay. And you may have to have a longer discussion before you get to an actual decision. And the other person understand that that's how they're being perceived. So to take more time to listen, and to have that conversation, let the other person say, hey, this is how I communicate, but it doesn't mean I don't respect your ideas, for example. And those are type of conversations that, again, gradually help the team to be able to work better together. So that's the first thing, is just understanding where you're coming from and where the other person is coming from in a personality level. And then the second thing we try to do is give people certain frameworks or very simple tools they can use to manage their emotions in the moment. And so like two of them that I talk about, I describe these as my rules of emotional intelligence. And I've developed 30 or 40 of them through the years. And it's nothing, I haven't invented these. They're common principles that people know, but I try to come up with simple, easy to remember frameworks that help you to actually use those principles. For example, we all know, think before you speak, right? But how many times do we speak too quickly, stick your foot in your mouth, say something that you later regret? I've done it countless times. So, I watched this this bit by a comedian one time, Craig Ferguson, television personality. He said, before you say anything, there's 3 questions you always have to ask yourself. Does this need to be said? Does this need to be said by me? And does this need to be said by me now? And then he jokes, it's taken me 3 marriages to learn that lesson, And, everybody laughs, but there's a bit of truth to that, right? Because we often get into these situations that we didn't have to be in because we speak too quickly. And so having that tool, I call it the 3-question rule. It helps you in meetings to hold back and not necessarily say something because maybe it's not the right time, or maybe you give the other person the opportunity to say it. Or sometimes it should be said by you right now, and that gives you confidence to go ahead and speak up and say that. For others who are more shy personality, that's that's not the right framework for them, right? Because they're always holding back. They're never speaking their mind. For them, I use a different question, and that's, will I regret not saying this? And asking yourself that in the moment can then help you to actually speak up and say the thing that you need to say. So that's one. Another one we could just talk about very briefly is called disagree and commit, which it's popular in some companies, but I find that a lot of organizations have never heard of this principle. And disagree and commit is all about having the healthy discussion, getting it all out there, not holding anything back, but voicing any concerns that you have and kind of taking the time you need to make a decision. But then once the decision is made, and there's always a decision maker, right? So someone is responsible for making that decision. And once that decision is made, then being able to support the decision. Look, we've put everything out there. We've discussed everything. And this is not a perfect decision. No one's saying this is a perfect decision. But here's the decision we're making. Can we all now buy into it? And because we've had the chance to speak our piece and voice our concerns, instead of now silently sabotaging the decision or becoming passive aggressive or continue to complain about the decision, can we actually try our best to make it work? And sometimes it's the leader himself or herself that has to disagree and commit, right? And say, okay, I'm going to make this decision because you all have presented, a solid case for it. I still disagree with it. I still don't think it's the best way to go, but let's go with it as a way of building trust with the team. And then again, the leader now has to fully support that decision and not silently sabotage it and not undermine it and really go all in with it. And if they do, then they're really going to build trust with that team and create a culture where others can disagree and commit at different times. So those two things, knowing our personality and the others and being able to see how we can leverage those strengths and work together, and then having a suite, we might say, of practical tools that we can use to manage our emotions in those emotional moments.
Some of the things that you're saying and some of the things that I've been saying through this episode, they are just interlinking so powerfully. Disagree and commit, what I love about that, I was talking about rightness before, right? Disagree and commit is a question that you can use to remind you to step away from your rightness. And what's the outcome of that? You build trust with your team, which speaks to wholeness. So I love that connection. When you said before about where's the good in it, right? When you're dealing with those difficult characters, when you're having those conversations that are full of friction and you're thinking, how do I navigate this personality? Maybe it's take a step back and think, where's the good in it? You're reframing, you're beginning to think about, okay, what's the intention that they have, right?
Yeah.
And then what's the action that I can take that helps me engage with who they are, because they might not be aware of it. And then what's the outcome of me approaching this relationship or this personality in this new way? Well, we might start working better together. Or the outcome might be that I start bringing them into different conversations at a different time that really play to their strengths. So again, there's that little intention, action, outcome piece of work at play. So I love kind of how complementary these approaches and these questions are. So powerful. And some of that stuff, by the way, like leaders, family members, solopreneurs, entrepreneurs, rewind the last 5 minutes and just listen to what Justin is saying, because those questions, if you start practicing them, because it's all about practice, right? If you start practicing them, you're going to find that they're going to start genuinely making a tangible difference about how you're showing up in certain conversations or how you're leading certain conversations. So I love those. Now, we love to finish the episode with something really, really practical people take away, right? There's lots there. We have certainly achieved that brief for sure. But if you could just say one thing that you want people to stick in their brains right now, what's the one thing that you want people to cling to when this episode finishes?
So one thing is that continuing to develop emotional intelligence, it's a lifelong endeavor, and don't give up on it, because a lot of people feel like, okay, they make a big mistake, they do something again, even though they're working on these things, they do or say something that they regret, that gets them into a situation that they now have to get themselves out of. That's normal. As sharp and as high as our emotional intelligence gets, we're still imperfect. We're still going to make mistakes. And I say that as someone who eats, sleeps, and breathes this topic, and am studying it all the time. And I'm looking at the best of the best teams and coaches and executives and developing frameworks and applying them. And still, I get myself into these situations sometimes. But the key is then learning from those and doing what I like to call an emotional postmortem, and then coming afterward and say, okay, why did I say or do this? What led me up to it? How can I avoid these types of situations in the future? Or how can I better manage, these types of situations in the future? And the goal of that, the outcome, the intention is not that you're going to stop making those mistakes 100%. No, it's that you reduce the number of times that it happens. But I just say, keep going with it, because it's a lifelong endeavor. It's about continuing to practice and continue to put in those reps. And going back to what you said just a minute ago, Dan, I'm a big believer that when you practice these things at home, you make yourself better in the workplace. When you practice these things in the workplace, you make yourself better at home for your families. So just keep practicing, keep sticking with it. And if you take a step back, it's fine. Just keep going and keep progressing.
So grounded, so practical. I love the honesty as well of you saying, I've been doing this stuff for years and years, and I still put my foot in it. One of the things that we could do together is like a week or month in review, where we sort of look back and acknowledge where we've managed to put our foot in it in the previous week.
I love it.
It might be more therapy for you and I, though, and not necessarily good listening for the viewers. So we'll discuss it.
You might be surprised, Dan. I find that like those cringe moments that I'm always so hesitant to share, right? Those are the ones that really resonate with people, and they see themselves in those situations like, oh yeah, I've done that. And as much as you learn from them, they can learn from those situations too. So you might be surprised how many people enjoy something like that.
Maybe the Dan and Justin Confessional is a new podcast coming to a channel near you. But Justin, it's been such a wonderful conversation, and I'm so pleased that we were able to put this together after a few months of talking, and for you to join me for episode 60. It just feels like a big moment for me. So thank you for making the time, and let's make sure that we speak again soon.
Sounds good. Thank you, Dan. All the best for you for the future of the program.
And that's a wrap for today's episode of Culture Crush. If you've enjoyed your time with us, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening from. And if you're a culture first leader, be sure to visit anthem.oo because we've got lots in common. See you next time.